a model of what Thames Street in London, Ontario looked like in roughly the 1860s. This model was created using the program Trimble's Sketchup. Thames Street was the location of the first African Methodist Episcopal Church in London, which became the British Methodist Episcopal Church in 1856. London, Ontario was a refuge for former slaves that had escaped from the United States. Once they had passed the border towns, they were at last free in the eyes of the British North American government. A group of these former slaves bought the property at 275 Thames Street in 1847. The African Methodist Episcopal Church was built sometime between 1848 and 1852. This chapel would have been significant for these individuals. By recreating the neighborhood that the chapel was located in, we can begin to have an understanding of what the congregation would have seen on a daily basis. Since this building is no longer a church, and hasn't been since 1869, digital recreations are a way we can understand what this area looked, sounded, and felt like in the mid-19th century. This is 275 Thames Street, the location of the Fugitive Slave Chapel. From the 1861 Dwellings of London map, we know that this church was a one-story wooden frame building. As the congregation was mainly made up of former slaves that had escaped from the United States, it was a simple structure built as a refuge of safety and worship. Although there is a lack of documentation, we do know that in the 1872 bird's eye view of London and in the 1926 picture of the chapel that was printed in the London Advertiser, the chapel had white wood siding and dark shingles. This is the inside of the Fugitive Slave Chapel. According to the 1863 London City Directory, the average congregation size of the Fugitive Slave Chapel was 75 people. They also held services twice on Sundays at 11 a.m. and 6 p.m. The chapel also ran a Sunday school that had 35 children and 4 teachers. There are no photographs available of the inside of this specific church. However, there do exist photographs of other African Methodist Episcopal churches from roughly the same time in Ontario. They show that the church most likely would have had an altar with a Bible and an organ for music. Now let's walk around the neighborhood to understand what it was like. The other buildings were depicted from the 1861 Dwellings of London map. It demonstrated that the buildings on the street were one-story wooden frame buildings, with the exception of a 2-story frame building, a 1-story brick building, and the factory at the end of the block. This tunnel is still in existence on Thames Street, right after the intersection of Bathurst. Not much documentation can be found on the factory, but it is believed to be a coal factory and is depicted in an 1897 photograph of this area. The Grand Trunk Railway Bridge was built in 1853. This is important for the neighborhood, as the sound and movement of trains passing would have been a frequent occurrence. This is Bathurst Street, facing east towards the Thames River. The house to the immediate left is a 1-story wooden frame building. The house in the upper left corner is a 1-story brick building, the only brick building on the block. In the 1861 Dwellings of London map and in the 1872 Bird's Eye View of London, this road that runs north and south is shown to be a dirt road like the rest of the city, but is not given a name. This road eventually became a part of the Thames Valley Parkway, which is a multi-use pathway system running alongside the river. Here is a section of the Thames River. This river has been an important part of the development of the City of London. The Fugitive Slave Chapel is located just after the forks of the river. The river continues alongside what is now the Thames Valley Parkway and curves up around Horton Street. Once again, here is a shot of the neighborhood in its entirety. A digital recreation is able to help individuals visualize what surrounded the Fugitive Slave Chapel in the 1860s. By piecing together the evidence that does exist, we can come to a greater understanding of the chapel and those who were a part of the congregation.